Hello and welcome back. I'm really excited to be here today with Wayne Miller, partner at Product Realization Group. And we're going to be talking about factory moves, selecting new factory partners, some of the things that are going on both in high volume electronics as it relates to factory moves, maybe geopolitical influence, as well as challenges in scale up scenarios, such as what's happening right now in a lot of AI infrastructure, networking, and data center related products. So I think there's going to be a lot of exciting things in this chat. I'm really excited to have you here, Wayne. You want to introduce yourself a little bit so our viewers know a bit more about your background and how seriously to take what you're saying?
Yes, shouldn't take it too seriously. Well, I'm Wayne Miller, and I am a partner for the Product Realization Group, and our company helps companies big and small help scale their products introduction, new product introduction, engineering, product development, new product introduction, supply chain, a lot of process development. We do quality, reliability, regulatory, all sorts of stuff.
All right, one-stop shop.
Exactly.
And you work with clients, like give us a sense of like the range of types of clients that you work with, just so that you have a
Sure.
sense.
Yeah, I mean, we work with a lot of startups, and there are early stage startups. There's startups that have had, $50, $100 million of revenue and investment. And then there's also larger companies that are, multi-billion dollar companies that we're doing work for. I am working right now for a company that's developing, kind of simulation products for the semiconductor industry right now.
Yeah.
And very, very complex, systems with lots of cables and a lot of electromechanical things, very complex printed circuit boards, et cetera. But I've also worked for high volume products that are kind of more like IoT sensor devices that we have to build a lot of.
Yeah, I think like probably your scale goes from like one a day to hundreds of thousands a day of like
exactly.
stuff. So that's pretty and high mix and single low mix situations too.
Exactly.
So full gamut, all corners of the 2x2.
Exactly.
Excited to have this conversation because we are sitting here at the beginning of February 2025, and there's a lot going on about a lot of talk about kind of the geopolitical environment and tariffs. And while I think a lot of folks are in kind of either like they make their plans and then they're kind of wait and see on what, if they're going to pull any levers on their plans. Like I think a lot of people are thinking about where their CMs should be located, and if they're, maybe they're thinking about actively doing moves now because they're already impacted by tariffs if they were building in China, for example. Or they are thinking about, well, if I'm going to start up new NPIs, like where should I put them? Maybe before we get into that, I'm just kind of curious, like what have you been learning or hearing about kind of people who are trying to engineer their supply chains as it relates to our new reality of the geopolitical environment?
Yeah, well, interestingly, it's really been underway for a while. So
2018, I think.
So, I've been working with several companies who are already in the process of moving factories for different reasons. And of course, the most recent events are, making people question, what to do,
if they were planning to go in a certain place,
exactly.
And is that place safe?
Yeah. But I think fundamentally, I haven't seen anyone, make sharp turns or anything. I think there was already a transition away from China to a certain extent, and even if it was going from China to another place in Southeast Asia, or a lot of stuff coming to North America, either in Mexico or in the United States. And I think one of the experiences that I had over the last year was, there was this Buy America, Build America program that one of our customers was needing to comply with. And we spent a lot of time trying to work on how to accomplish that, and it's not easy. And in this particular case, most of the product was built in the United States, and it was still difficult to comply because a lot of the electronic components, like the devices themselves, just aren't built here. And, when you do the calculations, it's a complex thing. Anyway, so I spent a lot of time doing that, but then you fundamentally need to just think through all the regional requirements, and there's a lot of rules that you work around, and it's like an engineering project to figure out how to comply with these things. And you're basically getting supply chain. We moved a lot of mechanical things over to North America and into the US, and a lot of printed circuit board assembly, and then the system build, et cetera. So
So it sounds like clients come to PRG and when they might be contemplating, one of the reasons they might come is they're contemplating like selecting a different manufacturing partner for a variety of reasons, whether it's they have like a new product that has new requirements and they're not confident in their existing partners, they want a new partner, they want to be in a different location, like there'd be a variety of reasons. And I think one of the things that it sounds like you can add value is you have like maybe a framework to helping a client go through this process of figuring out like who they should be working with and why. Maybe you could walk us through a little bit some of that framework, and how you kind of guide some of these decisions with your clients on how they even select where, and then we'll talk a little bit more about the nuts and bolts of the how you do that. But like maybe starting with like how you even select where to potentially either start a new product or move an existing product or replicate to a second source.
Yeah, I actually have had two clients really recently, one currently, that are all about kind of finding a new CM, and for totally different reasons. One is it's a new product introduction, and just wanting to kind of take it to the next level, and the current supplier was just a lower tier kind of capable company, getting it done, but as the company was increasing revenue and unit numbers, and the quality requirements were going up because their customers were very, kind of demanding customers, that whole thing just made them want to reconsider that. And then, of course, just cost. Once you start building a lot of product, you got to take a look at that, and it's obviously a good idea to, have a competitive situation to kind of get costs down. So basically, to get that company to look at different things, I created a framework that had us look at various things. Number one is, regional requirements. What are the regional things?
Yeah, how do you even know? Because like in this, there's like we're in this state where it's like not even really clear. Like, is Mexico even safe? Like, I think a lot of people were assuming that Mexico would be safe, and maybe it will be. We don't know. We don't know.
Well, the interesting thing on this one, it was really about the U.S.
So this was moving from somewhere that was external to the U.S. to in the U.S., and the location was like a core requirement for why they would do the move.
It was in the U.S., but there were a lot of subcomponents that were built in China
and are subject to tariff.
Yeah, I think the main reason for this particular company was to just be able to comply with this Buy America, Build America.
What is that?
It's basically a program that was done in the Biden administration, so that more manufacturing for companies that are working on infrastructure projects were funded here. So it was basically a way to get manufacturing more into the U.S. It wasn't grant money, but the money was there was funding going for grid improvements.
Okay.
So grid resiliency and grid stability and fire safety. So basically, there's a lot of demand for that stuff, and the government was trying to trigger extra efforts in that area and to try to get those kinds of products in the U.S.
Okay, so they had to essentially, in order to comply with some agreement they previously kind of signed up for, they needed to figure out how to move more of what they were doing into the United States, like particularly the circuitry.
Well, the whole product.
The whole product.
It's the whole system. So it's basically a boxed product.
But you said previously they were already building parts of it.
So it was all about trying to figure out how to do that. And then, of course, as they wanted to scale, the build quantities that were being built were more like 10,000 a quarter, and they're getting to the point now where it's going to be more like 100,000 a quarter. So, and the supplier that they had just wasn't positioned well to do that.
It's a large ramp up.
It's a big ramp up, and it's a good problem to have, but it's a real problem. And so when I put the framework together, you really want to think about, first of all, you need to think about how many people you want to look at, because it's a big project to actually go out and to get partner up and try to get RFPs or RFQs from all of these suppliers, and it's a lot of effort. And what I did was I put together kind of a whole package with kind of a explanation of what the product was, and the demand requirements, and the regional kind of choices that we were interested in, and some of the other requirements, things like technical competency and management compatibility, and then all the documentation, their new product introduction process, their quality systems. So there were a whole bunch of aspects of the framework that we spelled out in an RFP, and then there was a big release of documentation to the companies, and we assessed their feedback with kind of DFM feedback. We sent a bunch of stuff, so we wanted to have conversations with them about how they interpreted what we had, what kind of experiences they had that were similar to what we had, what kind of products that they had that were maybe similar or in the same kind of markets, same kind of environmental requirements, etc.
You said like it's really important to select a certain number, like to be maybe a little bit judicious about how many, because there's so much data and so much to process through. So you have a rule of thumb on like how many different, if you're going to do a CM selection process, like how many candidates you should consider?
Yeah, yes and no. I mean, it kind of depends on what you're doing. I think, we started wide, but weeded things down pretty quickly. So, started probably looking at 10 or so.
Okay. What was the main weed out factor?
Just, I mean, whenever you're going out and talking to someone, it's got to work for both sides, right?
Okay, so you get like vibes. Yeah, it's not even like documentation, it's just vibes.
There's vibes, and there's also, there's got to be interest on both sides. So, it depends. Some little companies, some tier one contract manufacturers might not be interested in working with a company unless if they're at a certain revenue kind of things. So, going through that early stage, but not going really deep at that point. And then we kind of got it down to about 5.
Okay.
And then, we probably went and got packages out to 5, but very quickly it kind of went down to 3.
Okay.
And then
just because the other 2, like essentially it was clear they were not going to be the right fit or they weren't responsive or something like that.
Yeah. I mean, you go through the process and, you make your decisions.
Okay.
And, we probably didn't eliminate the people,
at
least officially.
Like,
they just became very unlikely, scenarios. And, part of it was also just, to collect data. So, not just cost data, but all the data, to make sure you have a good decision process. And then, we got down to 2, and we went really deep with 2.
Okay.
And basically had meetings acting like this is going to happen potentially, with 2 of them, and then inevitably made a decision.
It's one of the reasons that people come and seek out your expertise. Mm-hmm. Like, share a couple of stories from the School of Hard Knocks on like where this can go wrong, that maybe you can do all the right things seemingly from this framework process, and it either goes wrong because of some small thing that was missed that like 2020 hindsight, like it was always there. Maybe you've got some horror stories that you can share that can help educate, lessons learned for our viewers who maybe don't have to relearn them themselves, or maybe there be dragons here, like watch out for this area. What would you share?
Well, it's not just about cost.
Yes.
Okay.
That's a good one to start with, because I think that like that's
cost.
Very compelling for many, and I think to their detriment. Maybe they don't realize actually, especially in the high volume electronic space, it really matters who's paying for every single little bit of every single thing, because it can create weird incentives, like who owns paying for if the first pass yield isn't at a certain point, or like are both sides motivated to work towards improving efficiency? And
no, it's all
that's
good.
my like soapbox, I guess, on
well, I think also a lot of people in the early stages will make promises that they don't necessarily keep.
Okay.
So it's really important to kind of go deep enough to really understand what it is that you're getting. One of the challenges, especially for early stage companies, is you go in there with partially completed stuff.
Yeah.
And when you have partially completed stuff, if things change and someone makes a commitment on your original design, they can say, well, it changed, and because it changed, and by then you're already locked in, and you can kind of get you could have problems.
It's just a lot more expensive than you expected. Your model could break as a result. So how do you avoid that scenario?
I think it's really critical to have like a baseline design. And, and one of the things
would you like have them quote last, like if you're working on the next gen product, Gen 3, and you have a Gen 2 product, should you have them quote Gen 2 so that you have like a baseline?
Yes.
Versus like your half finished Gen 3 that
Mhm.
Would that be a way to potentially avoid
I
that
think it's a
issue?
way. There's two different things I think you can do. One is to quote, just like you said, an existing product where you can just see,
How
their
it's different.
model.
Yeah.
But to me, the most important thing is to understand the business model of the company instead of just getting a total system cost and say, oh, I'm making this thing with 1,000 things in it, of which, 100 of them are custom, and then you come up with a number, understanding that, well, for this type of thing, this is how we mark it up. For this type of thing, these are the baseline costs, so that if you have a change, you can have a revision. And then when you change it, you can say, well, okay, I'm going to take this out and I'm going to put this in. And I know that your markup or your value add is going to be this in this place. Then you can, in a formulaic way, kind of figure out what the cost should be. It's not like some black magic negotiate that just comes out there. It's having rev control basically in the design and the cost. And I think it's a really critical point. I think the other thing is just getting deep enough with these companies to understand that they really know what they're talking about. And this is, again, it depends. If you're at a big company, the companies have a deep bench and they have a lot of different capabilities that are looking at a lot of different things. For some of these smaller companies, it's not that way. A lot of times they just drop, information there, and they're not even capable of getting all the details to understand what these things are. And it's really important to do that, though, because if you can work with a company that it really is a good business partner and, an honest company, they're going to really help you through it. But, if not, then you could get yourself in trouble if you don't really understand what you're getting. And then later on, you kind of pay the price.
So we talked about kind of how to select. Let's talk about how to maybe move or bring up a new vendor, factory, CM partner. If there's and maybe just to constrain it a little bit, we'll constrain it to where you already have something kind of going, whether it's in the middle of MPI, but it's kind of going, and you're going to move to a different location, or you're going to move to a different vendor. It could be in production as well, or where you're going to replicate to a different second source. Maybe you could talk a little bit about how you go about bringing up a second site. What are some of the core things that you want to think about in your planning as it relates to that, and avoid the pitfalls or the danger?
Yeah, no, it's a really interesting thing, and the first thing I'd say is don't just do a move from one place, stop and go to another. Not what you should do.
So don't stop at site one until site two is up and running?
Yeah, well, for sure.
Okay, okay. I don't think
to me, there should be an overlap.
Yes.
And a relatively significant overlap. The other thing that I think is important, there's always, to me, when you work with contract manufacturers, it's like you love them and you hate them, but it's the devil you know. You know what I mean? And basically, you have challenges and issues with the product, and a lot of times, when you're the developer, they're your problems because you created them. It's designed in, and you're frustrated that there's issues, and then you think that when you move to a new place, you've learned from all that, you're gonna avoid these issues, right? The reality is, in a lot of cases, you don't avoid those issues. You just have the same issues because it's the same product, and that's not to say that you can't up the game when you go to a new supplier that has more capabilities. Especially if you're really cognizant about getting someone who has more capabilities, more technical capability or whatever. But I think it's really important to kind of move the process as it is to the new partner.
Okay.
And
so like a lift
have
and
baseline.
Shift. Lift and shift.
I like that. I like that terminology.
Although you're not even you're more like copying paste.
Yeah.
Because you're not doing Control X where you're cutting.
I mean, first. I would say, kind of the copy exact almost process. Now, it all depends.
It becomes very difficult to do that if you have house vendors that you can't lift and shift. Inevitably, we're all engineers, someone's going to be like, but we could do it. We could make this change right now and get an efficiency, the cost or whatever.
Yeah.
And so there's lots of kind of very alluring siren calls for efficiency to do at the same time.
Yeah.
And so the lift and shift seems to be, or the copy exact seems to be a really good strategy. Have you seen that go horribly wrong where someone tries to change too many things in the shift?
I have a customer right now that was building stuff in the U.S. and moved their factory to Mexico.
Okay.
And basically what happened was they got all new regional suppliers for a lot of their stuff, and it's a very mechanically oriented product. Everything went awry, and basically things
so even
weren't
though
going
the
together.
parts were like to spec in terms of the drawings, but the drawing specs were not actually what they ended up needing to make a product that worked.
The problem was, since the production in the U.S. had been going for a while, everything that had changed wasn't documented.
Yeah.
So when they moved the documentation in the location, they got it all set up and built and tooled.
They essentially like went back in time by 5 years or something.
Exactly.
Plus new suppliers.
Yeah. So and it caused quite a stir, and it's a relatively large company. So
and this just costs a lot of money.
And more importantly, it cost them capacity. It made it difficult for their customers, right? Because lead times went up because they couldn't build the same levels. Because they shut down.
Yeah. Because they shut down Site 1 before Site 2 was up and
exactly
and capable.
So I think it's really important. The other point I'll make is, if you do move a factory from one location to another, if you start by moving the final assembly and keep all of the component levels, from original, that's a much easier transition, yeah. Right? Because you're not qualifying everything at once.
Yeah, scientific method, people. Controlled variables. Control as many as you can. Sometimes you are not able to do that because of the house brands or house vendors. But that's actually maybe going back to the primary or the prior point about working with certain CM partners, and whether you want to take the cost savings that may come from using a house vendor, but then not having the fungibility to potentially move that part and have that vendor go with you if you ever to move away from that CM.
Yeah.
So copy exact, key point. And then in terms of what about in the case where you're literally opening up a parallel factory? So you're not planning to shut Site 1 down, and just to add extra complexity, maybe that additional vendor is not the same company. Maybe it's either you're going from your own factory to an external vendor, or you're going from vendor A to vendor B. Yeah. But you're not shutting vendor A down. Right. You're going to continue working with them. What's kind of unique about that scenario for this factory replication kind of use case?
Yeah, there are a lot of interesting challenges. I'm going through that right now, where there's a European factory building a product that I'm working on, and we're transitioning to another US-based factory to build the product, but we're not shutting the other one down. So just because it's a complex product and having the capacity is really important. And the company that we're moving to is a tier 1, really high quality contract manufacturer with all sorts of capabilities and a lot of scale ability. And the one in Europe is a really strong company, but smaller. And one of the things that we learned, we went through a very systematic, process to, make sure that everything was ready and all the documentation. This is a bigger company, so good process and everything's detailed and everything's documented. But the one thing that ended up happening once we started building these things was, the smaller factory with the people who had building this complicated product for a long time, they kind of had expertise. Know-how, exactly. So getting that level of know-how in the new factory is challenging. And, because the documentation
and the new factory is a different vendor. So it's not like you're going to fly that knowledgeable team in and...
Well, so we were that.
You were that team.
And also the company. The company has representatives on both sides, but we weren't the ones doing the work. There's a difference between being the company that has the product and your level of support. You can be a big ops team kind of doing it, but then you're not the manufacturer who's actually on the ground, really responsible for building things and all of the know-how that goes into it. So it's been a really interesting challenge, but it took probably an extra 2 months than was originally planned just to get that know-how.
What would you say is maybe not for this customer, but in general, what do you think is a reasonable plan to do a replication of an existing relatively mature production product, off the cuff?
It really depends on the kind of product it is. I think if it's a high volume product that isn't super complicated, you could probably do it in 3 to 6 months. And
if it's super complicated,
I think if it's super complicated, you can probably do it in 3 to 6 months too. But it's
okay,
very different kind of problems. You know what
okay.
I mean? And it all depends. What the you know if you're going to go retool everything, and this is an existing product that I'm talking about.
Any in terms of setting up a replicated site and like trying to cross compare between two sites, if you have a customer who's kind of struggling with that now, or they have a similar case where there's like an existing factory, smaller, where like the yields are at a certain level, and that has been acceptable. The company's continuing to grow, so they're bringing up a second site that is a different vendor, much like a tier 1 vendor, tier 2 vendor, and they're going to do high volume there, and they're just having a lot of yield related problems that they don't have at site 1. And it's been very difficult to figure out like what's the difference between site 1 and site 2. And
totally.
So this doesn't sound like a surprise to you as a challenge. Do you have any tips for how you've seen that like accelerate that process? I mean, I certainly have ideas how instrumental can accelerate that process, totally. But like, what are your thoughts on like that particular pain point of getting, you're up and running at the second site, things are going okay, but they're not going great yet, and that your design can be great, like better, because you have like existence proof. So that they're not like definitely design issues. Some of them might be design issues, but it's not like inherently design, and some combination of like workmanship, design, and part quality that's creating these yield problems. Like,
yeah, I think it just requires a lot of boots on the ground. And
that's what they're doing, but it still doesn't necessarily converge.
No, it takes time. It takes time. And again, I think if you have a complicated product like I've been dealing with, it just takes time for all the workmanship that, if the product is sensitive to workmanship, it just takes a lot of know-how and training and experience. And then the other part is, even if you train a small group of people, once you start to try to scale, you have to, expand that training to a wider group of people. And then the other part is just documentation.
Yeah.
Because, you can't really transfer work instructions that are developed by one supplier to another supplier. So,
and also the work instructions are often, as you were previously mentioning, have undocumented know-how that is not in the work instructions.
Yeah, or it could be in a different language and all sorts of things.
I think in this case, like, the customer's perspective was, oh, well, if we put instrumental in the place where we're having the yield problem, we could use instrumental to help us accelerate figuring out the root cause of all that stuff faster.
Yeah.
And then we can drive down a Pareto of issues. Like, that's like a very reasonable thought process. And when I look at it, I'm like, no, you actually want to put instrumental in factory 1 too, because what you want to do is you want to be comparing like at the same places. You want to replicate it the same. And so we have other customers who did a global scale up from 1 factory to 6 factories, and then subsequently have now moved some of those factories based on various incentives from various governments. And so they've brought up probably 8 or 9 different sites with instrumental, and having had instrumental in like site 1 lets them very quickly see like, oh, okay, like, everything's good at station 1, but station 2, like, it's totally different. And like our yield is totally different. And we can go and we can look at the data and see what's actually different. Like, oh, this looks wrong. Or, we have these operator training things that we need to work on. And so like really pinpoints like what's going on kind of forward versus looking backward from your failures of like, here's my pile of failures. Let me look backwards and figure out what I need to change. It's kind of, you can do both, but you're like pincer attacking in from both looking backwards from your failures and looking like comparing between known good and your current like factory under test that you're trying to evaluate.
Yeah. And having a common data set is so critical
to be able to compare.
Yeah.
And even if you're going to move a factory, we're going to shut down site 1. Like, my recommendation is like, go slurp up as much information from site 1 before necessarily obviously don't violate any legal whatevers, but like before you share with them that you're moving, go get as much data as you can about exactly everything your process, and then you can lift and shift instrumental to site 2, and you have the data set you can refer back to. You can keep running at site 1 until you're up and running on site 2. So like that's another way of thinking about it. But if you're already up and running in site 2 and you have this disparity of performance, just like usually it's let data be your guide. And like it's so much faster than trying to fly your subject matter experts all around the world back and forth between these sites, trying to figure out what's different between these two sites. As humans are just not like, yes, we can watch something and see what's wrong, and we can go to that same site a week later to the new site and watch it, and it can look right, but it's technically like slightly different. And that can matter.
Yeah, well, for the OEM, it's really important to have standard kind of templates for reporting and quality and yields and any other critical data that is there. I think it's really important to do that, and then you can have it across two locations and you can compare it. It's apples to apples, right? It's super important to kind of take advantage of that. The yield at the place in Europe is higher than the one here, even though I would say that the facility,
the capability should enable a higher yield here. Like the ceiling is higher here. It just haven't like achieved it yet.
Yeah, exactly.
I guess like as we kind of wrap up the conversation, there's obviously a lot going on in operations, supply chain, like electronics as a field. You're not necessarily seeing it in a lot of like new consumer electronics devices at this moment, but there's, we're all AI engineers now because we work on the products that are enabling AI to be trained and developed. There's like the devices, the net new devices that people are kind of brainstorming and coming up with. There's all the disruption happening kind of with tariffs and the geopolitical environment. Like at this moment, with all in that like swirl of things that are going on, what are you really excited about for in the next year, 3 years? Like, what are you super pumped by in terms of either the types of projects or the type of work or the opportunity in the space for anything, actually?
Yeah. I have a lot of experience doing consumer electronics, and I worked at Apple, as you did, working on, high volume desktops and other kinds of products. And my interest now is much more about these complex systems. And I love data center stuff. I love these simulator, emulator kind of products that are really complicated and really challenging. You're not building, 100,000 a month or a day or something like that.
I mean, I think some of them they'd like to be, but you need a different power grid to do that.
Exactly. But they're really interesting, challenging problems. A lot of electromechanical challenges, a lot of cabling and things like that, just a ton of high density connectors, and you're jamming a lot of stuff, really complicated things, really expensive things in these products, and
then you're going to submerge them in goo.
Yeah, exactly.
Put all that stuff in it, and then you put it in oil or something. I'm newer to the space, like, similar background in high volume as the place I grew up. And when we first started getting into the data center space, I feel like I was very like judgy, snooty about like, oh, well, like their surface mount yields are only like 67%. I was like, what do they not know? Like, I mean, surface mount yields should be 99%. And just because that's what I know, right? And I think first pass yield at first functional test could be as low as 0%, and that is okay. Like it's workable in that model in a way that that would never work anywhere else. And of course, the devices are so expensive that everything gets reworked, and but every time you rework, there's a lot of sensitive stuff to break. It certainly seems like there's a huge business opportunity out there just for like Amphenol or these different connector vendors to design connectors that like have little LEDs that like light up when they're connected. So I need to patent that idea. But like the amount of interconnects, like literally just like little like plugs inside of blade servers, the rack itself, all sorts of complex semiconductor equipment, other stuff that goes in the data center. Like it's a significant portion of the failures are from different like plugs not being plugged in. And even just like the tolerances across some of these arrays for these data connectors that have, like it could literally have hundreds to thousands of pins. Like I remember when I started Apple, it was in the era of the 30-pin connector and like the vintage iPods, and like that was a lot of pins. I don't even know how you date them, like and measure a connector with reasonable GD&T tolerances that have 1,000 pins, and they're of course they're like tiny. So there's just like some really interesting mechanical challenges that are interesting to see, but there's so much opportunity there in that, like, I feel like a lot of there's opportunities for the high volume knowledge to come into the data center, like the development process and the ramp up process and all of that can be very valuable. It's not that they don't know, it's just they haven't had to be at higher scale. It's like worked as it was, and now it doesn't work anymore because they need to double, triple, 10x what they're doing. And so there's just like so much opportunity there. That's really exciting, I think, to see. And I'm sure there's lots of things for high volume to learn in this ramp up process as well. Because I think I'm seeing like a lot of willingness. Like a lot of the times they're building these networking, rackable data center. These are very tech savvy companies that are building them, that are the customers. And they're like often software companies. And they're like, can't we solve these problems with software?
Yeah.
And so it's very different than if you're, working on cell phones, like at high volume. Like, and they're kind of like, well, we've making cell phones for 2 decades. Like, we know how to make cell phones, not like super interested in pushing the envelope. We'll just keep turning our like little +1 like knob. Whereas on the data center side, it's like, look, we need double, triple, quadruple. +1's not going to make it. What kind of software, what kind of technology can we use? So I feel like there's a lot of innovation happening there.
Yeah, one thing that I think is interesting is, on the printed circuit board kind of technology side, these SMT lines have X-ray and, just optical inspection in line, and they're pretty well set up to do these high pin count, components. But at the system level, not so much. And I think one of the challenges that I think instrumental would be great if you guys could figure this out is, if there's high density of cables, we have like thousands of coax cables that are all routed, jammed into this box, right? And how do you make sure things are positioned the way they are? Because there's a lot of variation that can happen. On a printed circuit board, there's not much variation because everything's in place. It's been picked in place.
Solid.
It's there. Solid. It's soldered. You can X-ray it. You can see solder balls or solder. But with cables, you don't have that ability. And so how do you do that? And I think that would be very helpful in the application that I'm talking about, and I'm sure it would be very helpful in the data center as well. So that's
rack level inspection as like a frontier. Like, I don't know that anybody's like we've started to take a look at it, but I don't know that anybody's like, nobody's nailing that right now, and it's certainly a pain point. And I'm thinking rack level just because it's like routing of many hundreds, if not thousands, of different kinds of cables, some of which like fiber optics. So if they're kinked, like that can be damaged and broken and not work, right? And some of this stuff is like, it's an art, like, and it can be correctly routed but look very different from one operator to another. I think like maybe I'm really bullish on the opportunity for humanoid robotics in that particular case, because it's also a very high turnover position to do rack routing. Get all the blades in and you're just like plugging together all of them. It's just like a hard job because it's very on it. And it seems like that's a great application for humanoid robotics, because then they could all look the same, and then you could actually like maybe do these routing inspections where you have an expectation of what stuff looks like. But when everyone could look different but still be okay. And I'm not just talking about like the wires up a little or down a little. I mean, like it could be braided in a completely different configuration and still be okay. It's like really challenging for conventional technologies.
The worst scenario is when it looks okay and it's not.
I think there's like a good frontier there. We have ideas for ways technology could like meet that particular use case and moment, like even today's technologies. But I think that as the demand goes up, it's going to drive innovation in these areas. And I think that's really interesting. And for folk who are coming at this conversation from that high volume electronic side, might be thinking like, oh, like I didn't even know there were like interesting problems over there. And I think there's a lot of similar problems in like the infrastructure kind of products for power grid or electrification, or there's similar types of problems like the cables. A lot of cables, and the cables are important because they carry high current, and
things aren't torqued and they get hot.
Exactly. And like that, is also a problem in like automotive wire harnessing. And
that's right.
So I think there's like a lot of really interesting problems to be solved with technology, and also to solve like as process engineers, operations engineers, design engineers. And it's been interesting to even kind of hear from customers talk about like how design engineers kind of essentially improving. There's now just like so many more NPIs on the actual Blade server part of the world, that like the design feedback of the operator's fingers can't fit to like put these down, and so that means that sometimes they get pulled back up, like that's now actually being incorporated, because it's not like they only do one NPI every long period of time. It's like, oh no, we're going to do multiple NPIs this year because we're going to build these, and then we're going to build the next thing and the next thing and the next thing. We may never go to production on some of these different devices. It's just like a completely different paradigm. I'm very excited about it. Well, thank you so much for joining us today, and for sharing more about your framework for factory moves and thinking about bringing up new suppliers and how to avoid some of the common pitfalls, I guess, that can happen in that process. And maybe you can share where people can find you.
Product Realization Group.
Yep.
prgnpi.com.
There you go. All right. Awesome. Thank you so much, everyone.
Thanks. All right. It's a wrap. Good job.
Do you feel like we got to cover things that you...
Yeah, it was good.